Several years ago, I had the privilege of watching, if I may say, one of the most beautiful musicals, Broadway show entitled Fiddler on the Roof. And for those of us who have been to the musical and have seen the musical, we know that it centers around a couple, and the name of the couple is Tevye and Golda, who lived in a village called Anatevka. And we also know that they've been married for 25 years. But that marriage, as we know from the musical, was an arranged marriage, because that was part of the tradition during that time in Anatevka. And there would be a matchmaker who would come, matchmaker, all of that stuff. So he would come and make the match. And both the couple in the musical has 5 children, 5 wonderful daughters. But these 5 wonderful daughters would like to break the tradition. They wanted to get married, but they didn't want to have an arranged marriage like their mom and dad. So they get married eventually, and Tevye had a very difficult time with that. He had a very difficult time with that. And as he wrestled with this, breaking the tradition, in the second act, as Tevye and Golda were sitting, suddenly Tevye started to ask the question. And Tevye says, "Golda, do you love me?" And Golda says, "Do I what? Do I what?" And then he repeats it again and he says, "Do you love me?" You know the response. For 25 years, I watched your... all of that, right? But it sounded very awkward. You and I know that in a very polite society, and perhaps a very polite companion or group, we don't ask that question because it becomes awkward. It becomes uncomfortable. Sometimes it becomes even that there's a sense of an embarrassment, right? We don't ask that question because it is too personal. As if I go to someone and I say, "Do you love me?" And you go to somebody else and you say, "Who do you say that I am?" I mean, there's some sense of awkwardness and weirdness about it. So strange to ask that question. So when that question is asked of us, we try to find a joke and just dismiss it, like, "I don't want to answer that question." And we try to dismiss so that we don't really respond to that question. But in today's gospel reading, Jesus doesn't care about being uncomfortable. Jesus doesn't care about awkwardness. He goes to his disciples, he goes to Simon Peter, and asks the question, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" And we know what's happening in today's gospel reading, because we have just celebrated the Easter Triduum, and we know that on Holy Thursday, Simon Peter, the leader of the 12, and we know him as the first pope, and supposed to be the one who would lead the flock, denied Jesus. Not only once, he denied Jesus 3 times. And Jesus actually told them, "Before the cock crows tonight, you will deny me 3 times. And when he heard the noise, he knew he messed up. He knew he messed up. And so biblical scholars tell us that this is a way for Peter now to reaffirm his relationship with Christ. This is a way for Peter to once again experience God's mercy and God's forgiveness. And so the gospel takes us to the 21st chapter of John, the epilogue, where we find the disciples in the Sea of Tiberias. It is interesting to note that the gospel tells us this is already the third time that Jesus appeared to his disciples. And yet, the disciples still did not get it. They could not understand, and they didn't get the fact that they should be out there proclaiming the good news of the resurrection rather than going back to Galilee and going back to the former ways of life. But as John tells us in today's gospel, they were out fishing, and that is where Jesus meets his disciples just as he did when he first called them to be his followers. This time, he's calling them not to be fishers, but he's calling them to be shepherds. To be shepherds. And so Peter then, as soon as he heard it was the risen Lord, jumps out and goes to Jesus. And Jesus then invites him and the rest of the disciples to have breakfast. Reminiscent, the bread and the fish is reminiscent of the feeding of the multitude. It was after the breakfast when Jesus goes to Peter and asks a very, very provoking question. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Asks Jesus. And it is quite amazing that Jesus does not ask the question that you and I would ask to someone who hurt us. Jesus doesn't ask the question like, so are you going to deny me again? So are you going to amend your life? So are you going to change? So are you going to shut your mouth, you big mouth Peter? Jesus doesn't ask that. Rather, Jesus asks a question. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Because Jesus knows that only true love experienced, only true love that is experienced can change a person. Only a true love that is experienced can change a person. That the mark of a Christian, a follower of Christ, the mark of a Christian is love. It is love. And so it is with Peter. After reaffirming his relationship with Jesus, after experiencing that love, after experiencing mercy and forgiveness, Peter was transformed, totally changed, just like the first reading tells us from the book of Acts. Peter goes in the presence of the elders, and he says to the elders of the Jewish community at that time, yes, Jesus is risen, the one you have killed. And then he even says, the one who preached forgiveness and mercy. The forgiveness he, Peter himself, experienced. And no matter what they did to stop Peter and to stop the disciples, no one stopped them. Nothing had stopped them. They went out boldly proclaiming the good news of the resurrection because they have been transformed of God's love. And we all know that that love is experienced in service, in tending, feeding, tending. And so Peter goes out not only to offer his life, but he goes out to be the very first one to proclaim the good news and to serve God's people. Now, my brothers and sisters, in our spiritual lives, the roots of our spiritual life is, I believe, God asking that question to us again and again. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And just like Peter, we need to find answers to that question. Real answers to the question of God to us, do you love me? And it is fine to say to Jesus, yes, Lord, I love you, because we have all experienced God's love by merely looking at the cross. That is the sign of God's life-giving love for us. In the musical Fiddler on the Roof, towards the end of that second act, Golda responds to Tevye, to his question, do you love me? By responding, yes, I love you. We know that in that musical, although it went very ugly and dark in the life of Tevye and Golda, that was also the beginning of hope. When she said, I love you. Do you love me? When we truly are able to answer that question, we can be like Tevye and Golda and Peter. When we find the true answer to that question, do you love me? We will experience God's transforming love. And we'll find out even more that life is beautiful and full of hope.